Welcome, friends. This is Economic Update, a weekly program designed to present you with information and analysis about the major economic trends and developments and events in our lives. What shapes our incomes, our jobs, our debts, our futures, the economics of it all. I'm your host, Richard Wolff. I've been a professor of economics all my adult life, and I currently teach at the New School University in New York City. I also write regular economic columns for truthout.org, a remarkable independent source of news and analysis on economics and many other issues. I urge you to check them out at truthout.org. If you're interested in this program and the kinds of materials we offer, please note that we maintain two websites, both available to you at no charge 24/7 and full of all kinds of materials and elaborations of what we do relatively briefly on this program. The first one is rdwolff with two Fs.com, and the second one is democracyatwork.info. Not only will you find more information and references and copies of my writings and interviews on the radio and television, but there are lectures and entire classes that I've taught that are available to you there. In addition, you can follow us through these websites on Facebook, Twitter, and Pinterest, which we ask you to do. And it'll make it easier for us to communicate, you with us and we with you. And finally, both websites provide you with a way to comment directly on this program. That is, to send us your thoughts, your questions, your criticisms. We read each and every one and use them to design our programs. And we also select a few to respond to on the air. But please bear with us. We get many more of these communications than we could possibly answer, given the fact that we do this mostly on a volunteer basis. So let's turn to look at the economic conditions, prospects, as they appear in the United States and around the world as we go from the end of May into the beginning of June 2014. Well, the end of May brought, for me at least, and I suspect for many of you as well, the sad news of the passing of Maya Angelou. This was an important writer, to say the least, in the modern history of the United States and far beyond. Not only because her own life extended to Africa, North and South, as well as the United States, but because she was such a powerful writer in her poetry, in her novels, in her basic ability to translate the experiences of her remarkable life into a language and an imagery that none of us will ever forget. And for me, I thought it appropriate to bring this up because in a way, she's a model. Her work was a model of facing honestly, almost with a ruthless honesty, social conditions that were outrageous and inhuman. In her case, the focus was on racism and sexism. As a black woman in the United States, she knew all too well, but she had that uncanny ability to help everybody else not only see it, but as she said, feel it by means of her work. Nothing would give me greater pleasure than to think I might learn from her how to do that, along with all the others she's inspired, in terms of the economic realities we face, which she also talked about, but I would love to think of what we're doing as an attempt to try to face up, as she did so beautifully, to the actuality of the conditions and to the ability of human beings to face them, to rise above them, and then to transform them into something that's more human. The first regular update I wanted to share with you has to do with the movement of students in Latin America, and in particularly in the country of Chile. The last few weeks have brought remarkable news that the 3-year campaign of the students of Chile, particularly the university students, to confront the neoliberal regime there, The regime that, like in so many countries, thinks that what a forward-looking society ought to do is cut the funds it provides to education. These were students who said, no, 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 no. You're not going to solve the economic problems you caused, looking right at the power structure of Chile, the government and the major corporations, both Chilean and foreign, that dominate their economy. No, the students said, you're not going to solve the problem you created with your economic system by slashing and cutting our education. No. And for the last 3 years, the students put their bodies where their mouths were. They went on demonstrations that shook the world and that shook the government and the power structure of Chile. And it culminated a couple of weeks ago in a speech given by the president, Michelle Bachelet. And this president announced that she was going to make a major change. She was going to end the subsidies that go to for-profit schools. This comes out of the movement that thinks that a school that adds the issue of profitability to the issue of education represents an advance rather than a retreat from what the process of education is all about. She will stop subsidizing those, and she announced major moves towards the number one demand of the Chilean students, which is free, universal, public education at all levels as a basic human right. More power to these students. Amazing that they had the ability to see clearly, like Maya Angelou might have inspired them to do, and also to act politically and courageously against all the news reporters who said nothing would change, against all the politicians who announced that nothing would change. Guess what? The students persevered, and the changes are coming. And that's worth everyone knowing and paying attention. The second update that I want to bring to your attention has to do with a report issued on the 21st of May by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, one of the 12 Federal Reserve Banks across the United States. And this is a report produced by Jason Abel and Richard Deitz called I can't read my own handwriting. Jobs that have been created during the recovery is what the report's about. My apologies. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York covers New York State, northern New Jersey, and Puerto Rico. That's what it researches and that's what it writes about. And here's the interesting story it tells about the quote-unquote recovery in New York, northern New Jersey, and Puerto Rico. First, it points out that the recovery is extremely uneven. Wow, let's pursue that a moment. Uneven how? Well, it turns out New York, by their measure, has recovered, at least in terms of the number of jobs available to New Yorkers today compared with what it was before this crisis hit in 2007. But when they looked at northern New Jersey, the story was much less positive. And when they looked at Puerto Rico, there's no improvement at all. So it turns out that when you look at New York, northern New Jersey, and Puerto Rico, you don't have a recovery. You have barely a recovery in New York, excuse me, and none at all in Puerto Rico, and a very, very weak one, hardly deserving the word recovery, in northern New Jersey. But the Federal Reserve report is important in a second way. It looks at the kinds of jobs. And here it discovers something very, very important. High-skilled, high-paid jobs have recovered. But people with middle-level jobs, middle-level incomes, they haven't recovered at all. They're in worse shape today than they were in 2007. Part of their situation doesn't appear that way because many of those people did get jobs, not enough to give us a recovery of all employed, but they got jobs, but the jobs they got are at the bottom, very low pay. So if you look at the so-called recovery, you discover, even in the words of the Federal Reserve Bank, that it's highly uneven geographically, and it's highly uneven in terms of what kind of jobs did recover and what kind didn't. When you put these two things together, a reasonable person ought to conclude there is no recovery. Or at the very least, if you want to use the word, then honestly apply it only to those few parts of the economy that have recovered, and be honest enough to say that a recovery in having a job when you didn't have one ought to be qualified if the job you got now pays you half or less what it paid in the job you had before. This kind of looking a little bit below the surface can be used elsewhere. I was struck by a report on CNBC of May 27th by Diana Olick, in which she does some research about the housing market. So let me talk to you briefly about that. Over the last year, we've heard an endless amount of public relations stuff about the recovery in the housing market. Recovery, we are told, is measured by how many apartments or homes are being built. We're being told how the prices of housing and apartments is going up, etc. Well, they looked a little bit below the numbers, and they made use of a very important bit of research done by the Redfin Group. That is a Seattle, Washington-based real estate brokerage outfit that does very good research, as Diane Olick pointed out. And here's what we discover when we look beneath the numbers: that the housing market has begun to cool off. That the press noticed. We're still better off, more houses being built than a year ago. Prices rising more relative to what they were a year ago. But when you look beneath the surface, here's what happens. The 1% of the most expensive houses in the United States, they went up over the last year spectacularly. According to Redfin, 21%. That's the increase from a year ago to now in the price of the 1% highest priced homes. What about the other 99%? How'd they do over the same period of a year ago to now? Answer, they dropped an average of 7.6%. So let's do that again. The housing market, which has been doing great, we're told, and while it's slowing a little bit, it's still well better off than a year ago. That turns out not to be true for 99% of us. It's just true for the 1% at the top. And somehow this gets to be called a recovery in the housing market. Well, I'm reminded when I read all these things, and I point them out to you, of a famous story about Nazi Germany back in 1943 or 44. Two Germans were sitting on a bluff overlooking the Rhine River, which is a very important river in Germany. And one was saying to the other, "Isn't it fantastic that despite the war, we're doing so well? Adolf Hitler has an economy that's booming along. The traffic up and down the Rhine River shows how our factories are booming." And the other person sitting next to him says, "We're looking at the Rhine River here, Hans. I don't see anything. I don't see any barges moving. I don't see any traffic. What are you talking about?" To which Hans replies with his hauteur in high gear. He says, "You don't look at the river to learn about the economic activities. You look in the newspaper, and that's how you find out." Yes, what you find out in the newspaper and what's going on may or may not be very similar. Our next update. Yet again, a measure of recovery, but now more intelligently put, recovery for whom? Here I want to bring you information produced by Monique Morrissey for the Economic Policy Institute in Washington. And she does an interesting study. She looks at the average cost of a hotel room for a night and its relationship to the average daily pay of a housekeeper who cleans hotel rooms. All right? How much does it cost to stay in the room per day? And how much is paid to the person who makes it clean and nice and all the rest per day? Well, here's what she found. In 1982 and 83, the two amounts were roughly the same. Average room rate, about $40. Might come as a surprise to some of you who haven't been paying attention to what's been going on with hotel rooms. But the average price of a hotel room overnight in the United States in 1982 or 83 was about $40. In 2012, things had changed. Even though back in 82, 83, it cost $40 to stay in a hotel room per night, and it cost $40 to pay the woman, usually, who cleaned all the hotel rooms per day. By 2012, these two numbers had grown apart. By 2012, the average overnight room rent in the United States at a hotel was $106. But what had happened to the average daily pay of the woman who cleans the hotel? That had risen to only $83. In other words, those people who stay in hotels are paying $106, but those people who clean the hotels have not kept up with our economic increases. Their wages are falling further and further behind. Try to tell them about economic recovery. The last short update before we get into our larger discussions has to do with the stunning news out of Detroit in the last days of May. The latest commission to study and come up with a proposal for what to do with the largest bankruptcy any city in the United States has ever had or faced has come up with an extraordinary proposal. Before I tell you what it is, I want you to keep something in mind. Keep in mind the boast that our economic system, our way of organizing the production and distribution of goods and services, capitalism is its name, terribly enjoys boasting of its efficiency. How efficiently it uses land, labor, tools, equipment. Keep that little story of efficiency in mind as we hear what the latest proposal out of official Detroit is. They want to spend between $500 million and $2 billion, those are their estimates, to demolish 40,000 buildings and properties in the city of Detroit. Properties that are vacant, properties that are dilapidated, houses that have been damaged, worn out, fallen in on themselves, and so on. They want to spend public money to destroy housing. This is a country, let me remind you, that has a housing problem. It has people with no place to live, and they propose to destroy 40,000 homes. When did these homes become a problem? Some of them 20 years ago, others 15 years ago, others 10 years ago, others 5 years ago, and others last year. During all that time, neither the city of Detroit, nor the state of Michigan, nor the government of the United States was able to see anything, hear anything, or do anything. So the houses dilapidated. A house that caught fire was then able to set fire to the neighboring houses because nothing had been done. And why was all this abandonment of property happening in Detroit? The answer is very simple. Detroit was a city built on the automobile. That's where Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, all of them That's where they got their big starts. That's where they got their big growth. In 1960, Detroit had 1.8 million people. By some estimates, 2 billion people because of undercounting. Today, their population is less than half of that, around 700,000. Why? Because the auto companies decided they could make more money going somewhere else, to the American South, to Canada, to Mexico, and more recently, to China and Brazil. The companies moved to make more money for themselves. They left behind an economic disaster, which now we are told, after the neglect of that disaster for 25 years has, of course, only made it worse, that we need to spend billions of dollars of public money to destroy the houses that were not inhabited by the people who had no jobs when the car companies left. Is this an efficient economic system? Do you think this is an efficient way to use city land, city property? Is this an efficient way to build housing, to use housing, to maintain housing? Is it an efficient way to use public money? Stop. You know, and I know, that what we have here is an awful failure of an economic system. To figure out what its problems are, to be public and open about them, to invite a public discussion of how best to solve them, and to then let democracy decide who pays for the solutions to the problems who caused. We don't do that in the United States. We allow private corporations to go where they want, when they want, how they want, leaving behind whatever destruction and broken economic disasters they see fit to leave us with. And they let it sit and rot until the rot becomes so severe that the only solution they can think of is to destroy 40,000 homes and stores and buildings. By some estimates, it'll have to be much more. The only thing to say about this is we need to learn. We need to learn that we can't solve the problems of a city caused by private enterprises by figuring out which people in Detroit or Michigan or around the country are going to be taxed more to help solve the problems of Detroit. We can't have some of us living in Detroit set against the rest of us living outside of Detroit when the people who caused the problem and haven't contributed to solving it are laughing all the way to the bank, the car companies. But of course, if we don't learn from this lesson, and if we don't learn from the kind of courage and persistence shown by the students in Chile, well, I'll have more such stories to tell you in the future. Let me turn now to the first of our large topics. These are topics, to remind you, that I pick, often based on the emails you send us, on what you would like us to talk about, what issues you're interested in. And I want to thank Keith Harrington for having brought the next story to my attention and urging me with good arguments to attend to it here on the air. What I want to talk to you about is a growing international movement among students of economics, both undergraduate and graduate students. They are very unhappy with what they're being taught. They criticize, excuse me, folks. They criticize the curriculum. They criticize their teachers. They feel that the economics they're being taught is extremely narrow. They're only taught one theory, they say, even though there are alternative theories about how economies work and what problems they have and what solutions work best. They're not given courses in the different theories and their different analyses and their different proposals for solution. They're only taught one. And they're not happy about it. And number two, they think the one they're taught is extraordinarily unrealistic to boot. And here's what they mean. They say we look around the world today and we see a capitalist economic system that is not working for most people, that has produced a crisis on a scale of the Great Depression of the 1930s, a crisis that has lasted far longer than anyone foresaw, that has hurt more people than anyone, virtually anyone, predicted, that is costing a fortune in the losses of output, in the interrupted careers and lives of countless hundreds of millions of people. I mean, we're seeing an economic system in deep trouble, but we're taught an economic theory which says everything is fine, and we live in an economic system which doesn't have very serious problems, and when it encounters a few problems, it is the best self-healing mechanism the world has ever seen. We find this to be extraordinarily unrealistic. It's as if those students had said, as I did earlier today, that what is being spoken about in the media, what the pundits mostly tell us, isn't what is actually going on. So their first argument is what we're taught is too narrow, too focused on one theory, and number two, it isn't realistic. And the third thing they've had to say, very interesting, is that economics narrowness is not just about focusing on one theory, but not dealing with what is being learned about life in all the other disciplines, history, psychology, sociology, biology, and so on. That they don't like economics because it's theoretically narrow, but it's also intellectually narrow. It only focuses on its own little technical information, its own little technical models, without incorporating the rich learning being done elsewhere. Well, there was a story in the May 4th Guardian, the British newspaper, and there was also a long article on May 13th issue of the New Yorker magazine for those of you that would like to learn more about it. But there's an even easier way. So active has this student revolt in economics been that it has engaged organizations in many countries, and they've now gotten together in something called the International Student Initiative for Pluralism in Economics. I'll say that again. The International Student Initiative for Pluralism in Economics. Initials ISIPE. If you go to isipe.net, you can get all the information on that website you might like about this revolt of the economics students, an international revolt. Let me say first and foremost, as a professor of economics all my life, and an economics student before that I am thrilled about this, that I think this is the healthiest development in this field in many, many decades, basically back until the 1960s, when organizations like the Union for Radical Political Economics was born out of many of the same concerns. It takes courage for students to go against their teachers. That's who the authority is in the classroom. It takes an openness to different ways of thinking that is remarkable among students because it is so rare among their economics professors. It's also a sign that if change is going to come, long overdue change, to our universities, it's likely going to be the students who make it happen. Just as it's the students who have transformed the economics of education in Chile, it is students that now want to transform the very nature of teaching and of what is taught in more and more universities around the world. Maybe they, by their activity, will be a model for the faculty and the administrators that are so much slower to get going to make the changes they should have made long ago.
When some people struggle with their mortgage payments, they become frozen. But the people who take action are far more likely to get the most positive outcome. Call this free government program for the option that's right for you.
Before our mid-program break, we were talking about this remarkable international movement among students of economics, both undergraduate and graduate. And I had just finish telling you about their website, isipe.net, the initials referring to the International Student Initiative for Pluralism in Economics. And I want to say a few words about the field of economics to help you, my listeners and viewers, get a feeling for what's bothering these students beyond their very eloquent statements. First, one of the things I learned as a longtime student of economics in the United States, both undergraduate and particularly graduate studies, was that economics departments were peculiar in a way that other departments were not. The way economics departments were peculiar was this. I began to realize as I sat through course after course that what I was being taught was not about how economies work. That really was a secondary issue, and in many courses it never arose at all. Instead, what I was being taught was an elaborate theoretical argument about why capitalism, the system we live in, a system of private property and markets and all of that, was the best system human beings could possibly hope to achieve. In other words, my courses were what I would call justifications or rationalizations or celebrations of a particular system, namely the one we had. It became clear to me that economics was a way of celebrating the status quo, celebrating what exists. And my teachers and the curriculum were very uninterested in looking at critical theories, critical arguments about our system,
Wolff,
and they were particularly uninterested in looking at alternative theories or alternative systems. True, many curriculums had a course called Comparative Economic Systems. But in 99% of our universities, these were courses that found in this title yet another way to say how what we have in the West, in the capitalist part of the world, was the best thing since sliced bread, and the alternatives were really very poor second and third choices that no reasonable person would want to spend any amount of time learning about.
Our lives in so many ways.
So bad was the focus of economics on justifying the system that even businesses across the United States in particular, and I know the history of economics teaching in the United States better than I know the history in other countries. But so irritated were the business community that they were getting these students who could justify capitalism to beat the band. But they didn't know how the system worked that they were so busy celebrating. They didn't understand the nitty-gritty of business at all. And so the business community said, look, we really like it that you're spending all this time basically preaching to the student body how they should love and celebrate capitalism, the status quo, what exists. We're glad you're doing that. But you know, you're next to useless for teaching our young people how the economy actually works so that they can go out there and be productive workers in a business or start a business or build a business. This is what we need. And so in America, the solution to this criticism of the business community was to create a parallel curriculum. Side by side in most American universities, side by side with the economics department, is another department that teaches economics. Only we don't call it that. To save face all around, we call that second program business school. You go there to learn how businesses actually work, how taxation affects a business, how a payroll program affects a business, how businesses have to do advertising, marketing, accounting, and all the other real-world issues which we've consigned to the business school. If you understand that, you'll see why students might be very irritated to be learning theories that are all about celebrating the status quo at a time when the
Let's give
economy
you,
they live
an
in
example.
doesn't look
Up
anything
until
like
about
the
2
economy they're
decades
being
ago,
taught to
20 years
celebrate.
ago, for most
It's
middle-class
because they have no
families,
contact with a
financial
curriculum that
aid,
tries to deal with the actualities.
was
That's done
only
somewhere
marginally
else
necessary.
in
They
the
could
business
afford,
school. And there they don't
college
much interested in
education
criticism
for their kids.
either, which means
Today,
a student who
more
would
than
like to be
7 out of 10
exposed
college
to the
seniors
critique
borrow
of something
to
that
pay for
strikes him
college
or her
and
as not
graduate
working
with
real
an
well
average debt
isn't going to
of
find that,
$30,000.
and that's making students
Okay?
upset,
Wow.
angry, and critical.
Revenue from
Second, I
tuition,
discovered as a
students are
student
required
and
to
then as a
pay,
teacher
accounted
that it
for
takes time
44%
to learn
of
a
all
theory.
operating expenses.
There's a
of
reason
public
why
colleges
graduate
and
school for most
universities
economics
in 2012,
professors in the
that
United
was the
States
highest
is
share
something
ever.
that they spend
25
3,
years
4,
ago,
5, 6,
tuition
or
paid
more
for
years doing.
20%
They
less
take
than
lots of courses,
In
2
other
to 3
words,
years worth of them
what we have
usually.
done
And then
is
they spend another
required
several
our
years
young
becoming
people
specialized
more and
in
more
some
to
literature
pay for
that will
college
allow them to
education
write a doctoral
themselves,
dissertation.
because the government,
In other words, they
isn't
spend
gonna provide
years learning
the
a
money
theory and then
to
years
educate our
learning how to
people. We're
apply
not
and
gonna
use
make
it
public
to write a
education
piece of analysis.
the training of our
If you're
young people,
honest
who will
and
therefore
open
be more
that there are
productive,
more than
making
one
our
theory of
businesses
economics,
more successful,
and that your
making
students should
our
be
economy
proficient,
more
at least on some
efficient,
basic level,
giving
in
us
all
a
of
secure
them,
place
in
the
order to
future.
be able
We're
to
not
enter the
gonna do
debate
that
about
we
which
all
of them
benefit from
to be
as a
used
collective expense.
in forming policy,
Instead,
in
we're gonna
changing
keep the
for the
burden
better
more and
our
more
economic
on
system.
The individual
Then you're going to have
family
a
of the
curriculum
students.
that gives
Here are
significant
these statistics,
attention
which, by the way,
to
I
these
have gotten from
alternative
an
theories.
excellent report
Because to learn
put
a
out by the
theory, as we
Demos
know from the one
Foundation,
we celebrate in the United States,
DMOS, the
takes
paper
time,
called The Great
takes
Cost
faculty,
Shift
takes multiple
Continues.
people to
State
teach
higher
multiple
education
courses.
funding after
That
the
would mean
recession.
our faculties have to include people who are
Um,
proficient.
Let's see where.
Well, let's see.
this
Proficient
goes.
in what? Well, besides the theory that we celebrate
49
capitalism
states
with,
out of 50,
a theory
the only
called
accepting state is North
neoclassical
Dakota,
economics,
are
for
spending less
historical
per
reasons.
student on higher
There are
education
two big
than
other
they did before
theories.
the Great Recession.
One is
that
called
is before
Keynesian economics.
2007.
It comes out of the Great
49 out of
Depression
50 states
when a
are
very
cutting
acute
back
British
expenditure.
economist, John Maynard
Wow.
Keynes,
Between
made a
2001 and
critique.
2008, before
And
the
the critique
recession
said
hit,
capitalism left to
33 out of
itself
50
produces
states
great
did that.
downturns.
In
Something
many
which
states,
might
the
strike
cuts
you
have
as
been
interesting,
especially deep.
considering that
Since
we're
the
living in
recession,
one.
28 states
And he came
have
across
cut
with an
per
idea
student
that said
funding
the
by
government
more
needs
than
to intervene
25%.
to minimize
compared to
the
just
damage
one
caused
state,
by
Michigan,
these
that
crises,
did so
to
between
reduce their
2001
severity,
and
to make them
2008.
less
Poor
frequent.
Michigan,
In other words,
they did it twice.
capitalism doesn't work well
All
unless
right.
and until
Now let's
it
take
has
a look
massive
at what this
ongoing
means.
government
And here's the
intervention.
most important point.
Keynesian economics
of all.
isn't taught in most
need to
American
understand
universities at all,
that we are
or
shooting ourselves
it's
in the
taught
foot.
in a way
We are
that dismisses it, a
decimating
little bit
our
like those
education system.
courses in
We are
comparative
making it harder
systems
and harder
I
for young
talked
people
about,
to go to
that
school.
dismiss
So many of them aren't doing
rather
it.
than
We are
analyze
forcing them to consider
these alternatives.
training in only those fields that
So
pay,
it makes
and not
perfect
in the
sense that
fields where
graduate
they'll be more
students who
excited,
become
more
aware
committed,
of the
and more interested,
Keynesian
and
criticism,
therefore more
or
productive.
even more
We
the
also
Marxian
say that if you
alternative.
don't have the money
Because Marx
to pick
said,
up these
with or
debts
without
to pay
the
these
government,
bills,
more
you
or
don't
less
qualify.
involved,
You're not gonna be an
capitalism
educated
itself has
We are
such profound problems that the
and
government
making it
can't
possible
solve.
for
And that
higher
the
education
solution
only for those
to
who can afford
capitalism's
it.
deepening
That goes
problems
against
is to go to
all
another
of the
system
basic ideas
called
of the
socialism,
kind of
communism, or
system
something
we're
else.
interested
Of course,
in
if you
having.
want students to
I
be
think
able to
this
even
is an
think like that,
extraordinary
to explore what those
commentary
possibilities
on
might
what is
be,
happening
to develop
to
whatever
our
insights that
society.
theory
And I'm very
enables,
distressed about it,
well, then
and
you've
I
got
hope
to have
you
those
are
people in the
as
university. And what
We
the students
shouldn't
are
be
saying
doing
is, they're not
We shouldn't
here.
be
We don't
collectively
have
funding
Keynesian
higher
faculties, and we
education
sure don't
as
have
most
Marxian
other
faculties.
countries
We don't
in the
have anyone to
world
teach it.
do.
And so what you're
We
doing
are now
is
saying
the
that we are
equivalent
gonna require
of the following.
individual
Imagine
family
that
to carry the
university
burden. The
courses taught
society as a
religion.
whole
And when you took a course in
benefits,
religion,
but the
what you learned
individual
about
is
was
gonna
the
have to pay the
particular
cost, rather than the
details of
society that
one
benefits
brand of
collectively
Lutheranism.
gathering the cost.
Now,
Instead of
surely
gathering the money from
Lutheranism
those
is part
most
of
able to
religion,
pay,
should
those
be
who
taught.
make the most
But you
profit
wouldn't want
off of
to
the
call
productivity of their
religion
workers,
something
we're saying,
as
no, 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 the
narrow
workers
as just
themselves
Lutheranism.
have to pay.
You'd I'd want the religion
What a
program
strange
to teach about
notion of what
Catholicism,
community
about
might
Presbyterianism, about Buddhism,
The last of the
about
major topics
Islam.
I want to spend a
In other
few
words, you want
moments,
to
discussing with
teach
you,
the course in an
have to do
honest
with
way that confronts the
lotteries.
reality of
I wanna talk to you
alternative,
honestly
contesting,
about lotteries.
different
I understand
religions.
that many of you
The
buy
students
those
want
scratch
that.
tickets.
And
I
there
understand
is
that
no
many of you
excuse
purchase
for not
lottery
providing it.
numbers at your local
But in the
lottery
United
dealer,
States,
in the states that
you
have them,
can't provide it the way universities
But I
are
want to
organized.
be blunt and honest.
They're
with
very
you
small-minded,
about what lotteries
self-contained
were and are
institutions
and why we have them.
that teach one thing
Before the 1980s,
and then give the
there were
jobs
little or
they
no
have to the
lotteries
students
in
who've
the United
learned
States.
that one
Little or
thing,
no
who
scratch
then can
tickets.
continue
And
to
the
teach
reasons
that one
were
thing
simple.
as if it
We
were
had
the
a
only
tax
way
system
to
that
think
worked
about
reasonably
economic
well.
issues
It
and
raised
economic
money in
problems.
part from
The wonder
poor
isn't
and
that
middle
students are
income
protesting.
people, and
The
it
real
raised
wonder
money
is,
from wealthy people.
why
The
haven't
top
more
income
students
tax
joined?
bracket,
Why hasn't this
my
happened
mistake.
before?
The top
But that's not a
income
criticism.
tax bracket
What these
for the
students are
richest
doing
people in the
is
1950s
extraordinarily
and 60s was
productive
91%.
and
Even
profound,
in the 1970s,
and
it was
they,
still
like their
70%.
brothers and sisters in
Theory
Chile,
of the
deserve
progressive
our
income tax
support
was if you
and
have
our
more,
applause.
the government takes a larger percentage.
The next
from
topic
you
I want to
because
talk
you
about
have the greater
is
capacity to pay.
um,
We did pretty well
advertising.
as a nation economically.
And I
in the
want again,
50s,
as I did with
60s,
the
and
earlier
70s.
topic
We
of
had our
Detroit,
problems, but we
to
did
ask you to
pretty
keep
well.
in
We
mind
have much
the
greater
boast
problems now.
that our economic system is
The
all
irony
about
is
efficiency,
we have lower taxes
all
on
about using
corporations and lower
land,
taxes
labor,
on
and
the
capital,
rich.
tools and
But of
equipment
course,
and
there was a
people in the
problem
most efficient
when
way
you cut
possible
taxes
to
on
produce
rich
the goods
people
and services
and you
that
cut
we as a
taxes on
community
corporations.
most
And
want
you
to
even
have,
cut
et
taxes
cetera,
a
et cetera,
little
et cetera.
bit, not much.
Keep
on
that in
middle and
mind
lower
as we
income.
analyze
It meant
the
the government
advertising
was
industry.
bringing less money
First,
in.
let's be sure we all
The
understand
government, the
advertising
politicians in our
is an
society
industry
are
in this
afraid
country
to tax
that
corporations and the
employs
rich.
huge
That's why the
numbers
tax
of
on them
people
has come down so
and
far.
accounts for
The
an
rich and the
enormous
corporations
amount
have a simple
of
threat
business.
they hold over politicians. If you don't
Here are
cut
the
our
statistics.
taxes,
For
we're gonna throw our money
2010,
to your
the numbers, of
opponent
course, would
in
be
the next
larger
election,
if we
and you're
updated
gonna
them to
lose.
2014.
And they've been pushing the
But in
Supreme and other
2010,
courts to give them greater and greater
spending on
latitude,
advertising
greater
in the
and
United
greater
States was
latitude,
143
to give money.
billion,
As you
that's
know, in
with a
recent
B.
decisions, there are
And in the
literally
world
no
as a
limits
whole,
on how much money
467
corporations
billion.
and
In
rich
other
people
words,
can
in
give to
2010,
get the politician
global
of their
spending
choice.
on
And who's that?
advertising
The
was
politician
half
that
a
cuts their
trillion
taxes the
dollars.
most. And that's what they've got.
It is huge.
But that has pinched what governments
And yet
can
the
do.
industry
For
is
a while, they jacked up the taxes
young.
of the mass of people.
It basically begins, modern
Even to this
advertising
year,
does,
last
in the
year, we
1920s,
pay back a high
here in the United
payroll
States,
tax
and it
that had been
begins,
reduced during
and
the
there's
Great
an
Recession,
enormous
2009,
historical
10,
irony
11,
here,
because we were having
with the
such difficulty,
tobacco
but they
industry.
raised it again. Can you
The big
imagine?
explosion of
Amazing.
advertising was to promote
But
cigarettes.
then the people revolted.
And for
That's
the
why
next
so many Americans
70
are
years,
just dead set against tax
advertising
are willing to support
was a big part
extremely
of the
conservative
budget
politicians
of the
with whom they
cigarette
disagree on a
companies.
whole range of
They
issues.
spent
But they are
billions of
desperate
dollars,
not to have their
employed
taxes raised
tens of
because
thousands
they
of
can't
people
pay it anymore,
develop
and they can't control
and
what
to
they have pay
disseminate in
prices
this
for the
society,
goods they buy
on the
and
billboard,
services they
on the
buy.
back of the
So they wanna
magazine,
control the
in
politicians,
the
so at
on the
least their taxes
television,
don't go up.
wherever you turn
The
to
politicians
see
then, however,
advertising,
don't have the money
messages
to do
urging you
what
to
the
buy
big corporations
something.
and the
That's
rich and the
all
mass of people
advertising
want
is.
them to do in the way of
You
providing
saw
services.
advertising for
How
cigarettes.
could they solve this
For
problem?
decades
Well,
after the cigarette
big solution
companies
of the government
knew
has been to borrow
that
money,
smoking
which is why
cigarettes,
they
whatever
all go
else
into
it did for
terrible
you,
debt.
also gave you
Because
cancer.
That's not a mistake they're making. That's the only way to resolve the
continued
situation
to
in which
advertise
you fear
this
to
product.
tax the rich. because
And
they
I
won't
want to
give you the
talk to you
money,
about that
and you
because
fear
of
to
its
tax the mass of
economic
people, so they won't give you
significance
their votes. And
and
yet
because
the
of what it
mass
tells
and the
us
rich
about
want you to provide the
efficiency.
services. So you borrow
Was it
instead. We've
efficient
been through that. But there's
for
another
the
it's
cigarette
much smaller,
companies
but
to
another
be
way
allowed
of solving
to
the problem,
flood
and
the
that's
television
called
and the radio
gambling,
and the newspaper and the
lotteries,
billboards
scratch
with
tickets.
ads of people
These
happily
are
enjoying
simply a
cigarettes.
tax called
Was that
something
efficient?
else. How do I
Was
know
that the best
Let's see.
we could do
First,
with
if
all
you
of the
see
equipment,
who buys
all of the
bulk
artistic
scratch tickets
talent
and the lottery,
that's
then
involved
just
in the
guess what?
advertising
It's the
business?
middle and the lower income.
Was that the
It's
best
the
we could do
people
with all those
who
people
they are
and all
afraid
those
to
talents
tax.
and all
But
those
now they
resources
found a
was
way to tax them,
convince
a way to get
folks
money out of
to
their
smoke
pocket to run the government.
cigarettes.
Here's
While
how
you're
it's done.
thinking about
By
that,
telling them
let's
you have a
analyze
1 in a million
advertising.
chance to win the lottery. You have
It's
1 in 1,000 chance
an
to
industry
win a buck by
that
scratching
figures
your
out ways to get
It's
you to
just a
part
tax
with
in
your
another
money.
name.
Advertising
it's not
says
even
buy
as good as
this.
a tax.
No, no, no,
If
buy
you pay a
that.
tax, at least then the money
Advertising
goes
is the
to
way they
government,
wrap the
which is
soap
supposed to
so that
use
you
it
think
to
you're not only
provide
getting
services.
something that'll make your
When you
body
buy a
clean,
lottery
but it'll be
ticket,
something that makes
first,
you smell
a
wonderful
portion
and that
of that
makes
money goes to
people
the
interested
store
in you
owner who
romantically,
runs the lottery
etc., etc.
machine where you bought your ticket.
Advertising is that picture
Another
on the
part of that
billboard
money goes
of the
to
happy people at the
bureaucracy
beach
that puts
drinking
out
beer.
advertisements about the lottery,
Advertising
that runs
is the
the
story
lottery,
they tell you that
keeps the
this
records
car
of the
has
lottery.
all of this power
And
that you
finally,
will
a
be
part of what
powerful
you
because
pay as a
you're
ticket
driving it.
is the money used to give to
You
the few
know,
individuals
we all
who
know
win
what
the lottery.
advertising is
So what's actually
because
left
it
for the
overwhelms us
government to
every
use to
day
provide
1,000 times.
is much less than if you had called
when
a
you
tax
actually
a
go to
tax
buy
and
something,
had it paid as
let's
such.
look at this.
But you know, it's
If you're
worse.
smart, if you're
When you
thoughtful,
sell
like
lottery
most folks
tickets,
are,
here's what you do.
you will go and say to
You
a
take
friend,
a
a
little bit
neighbor,
of
a
money
relative,
from lots of
I'm thinking
medium
of
and
buying a
low-income
car, a
people. They're the ones
toaster,
who
a
buy
software
most of the
program,
tickets.
whatever it is.
That dollar.
And tell me, what's been
Mrs.
your
Smith
experience? And you
uses
expect
to buy a lottery
your
ticket,
friends and
she might
relatives to
have
be
used
honest, to say to you,
buy
well,
a
I
piece
ended
of
up buying
food,
brand
a
X.
piece of
It was
clothing.
strong in these ways
That would have
and weak in
created
these other
demand for
ways.
goods and
But when I
services.
compared it to
That
the
might have
strengths
created
and weaknesses of the
jobs
alternatives,
producing goods and
this is the
services.
thing
That
I
might have
did.
created
And
income
I had
for
a
the
couple of
people
years
who spent that
experience, and I
money on.
learned that it probably would be better
That
to
in
go
turn
from
would have
brand
been
X
turned around by
to
those
brand
people.
Y,
It
and
would
so
have
I
been an
changed.
economic
This is
stimulus.
useful advice.
Instead, that
You've
money
got
is
useful
withdrawn
advice
the
from a
economy
thoughtful
and
person
given to whom?
who talks to
To
you
a
about
few
the
people who
strengths
become
and
rich.
weaknesses,
And here's what we
and
know
thereby
about rich
provides
people.
you with
When
good
you have a lot
advice.
Of money, you save a good portion
In
of it.
contrast,
You don't spend it.
advertising
back.
is bad
You're rich enough
advice.
to be able to enjoy
Why is
life
it bad?
and still have
Because
savings
you
for the
know
future,
that the
and you
person
indulge
delivering it
that
to you
desire.
is not interested
And so the
in
result is
providing you
less of the
with
money is
information
spent
on
on goods and
strengths and
services.
weaknesses.
You know what we need in
The
the
name of the
United States
game
today?
in
More money
advertising
spent on goods
is
and
the
services
strength,
to create
please.
demand, to create
The
that money to
advertiser
turn
tells
over
you
to build the
everything
economy.
about a product's
lottery
strength.
Takes a
You
little bit
hope
from
it isn't
everybody
all
and concentrates it
invention,
in the hand of a few who will
but
not
you
spend
must
it.
know,
It
unless
actually
you
makes
really were born
our
yesterday,
economic
that an
crisis
advertiser
worse.
is never
Not
paid
good for
by the
government
producer of
expenditure
anything
because so
to
much
tell
of the
you
money
about
can't be
problems
used
it
to
has
provide
or
services.
weaknesses it
So it's a
suffers from
substitute
or
tax
failures
that doesn't
it
work
has
as well as
accounted
a
for.
tax.
No, no, no.
And what's the
An
basis?
advertiser,
Mirage.
you know,
Giving
is a source
middle and
of
low-income
lopsided,
people facing a
one-sided,
disastrous future
unbalanced
in a declining
information.
economy, the
If you knew that a
fantasy
friend or
for a
relative
few
of
hours
yours
of
would
imagining
only
what
tell you
I would
one side
do
of the
if I had
story,
$1 million,
either all the
what I
good
would do
things
if I
about
had
something
10,000.
or even only all the
And for
bad
those
things,
few
you would
hours
after a
of
while
cruelly unsatisfied fantasy,
not rely on
we
their
have
advice real
an
much, would you?
inefficient
No,
tax
I didn't think so.
substitute. That's what lotteries
You'd know it was
are.
unreliable.
And they are
Well,
typically
advertisers
used by a
are
society
unreliable.
that does not know
They
how
are
to
an
solve its
unbalanced, a
problems
poor source.
better
And
than
by the
that.
way, if you're interested in getting information
Okay,
about
we've come
goods
to
and
that part of the
services
program
that is
where I
balanced,
respond,
there are ways
to
of doing that.
questions
The
that you have
Consumers
sent
Union
in,
was developed
and
in the
today I
United
wanna
States
respond
decades ago
to
to produce a
several.
magazine,
First,
and they now have a website
technical
where they will tell
question,
you
easy
about
to
the
answer.
strengths and weaknesses
Does the
of
Federal
alternative
Reserve
brands and so
create
forth,
money?
and so you can make
The
a
answer is
rational
yes. That's
decision.
one of its central
Rational
functions.
because you're
Federal
not
Reserve,
which
which
to
is what the central
advertisers
bank
who
in this
are,
country
as I've
is.
pointed out,
Every country
very
has a
poor
central bank.
sources.
In most
Well, what do
countries,
the
it's
advertisers
called the
say
Bank
to
of
defend
Japan or the
themselves
Bank of
from
England
this sort
or
of
the
criticism?
Bank of France.
Well, one of
We
the
can't
things
call
I
it the
found
Bank of the
charming
United States because of our
was the
history,
following.
when we once had such a bank.
Pepsi-Cola, for example, and I'm picking them up. I didn't have a
So
conversation
we
with them, so I'm
rechristened
just
it
using them as
the
an
Federal
example.
Reserve
Pepsi-Cola
System.
would
It's
say,
just
for
our
example,
bank.
we have to
And one of the
advertise
tasks
because if we
of the
don't, then
banking system,
everybody
of the
just sees
governmental
Coca-Cola,
banking system,
and they'll just
and the
think
Federal
about
Reserve is a
Coca-Cola,
kind
and they
of
won't think about
composite. It's
Pepsi-Cola,
partly the
and so we
government
have
and
to
partly the creature of
advertise
private banks
because
who
our
have a very
competitors
powerful
do.
influence in
Now
what
let's be
happens
economists
today.
for a minute and
But
analyze
one of the
that.
jobs of the central bank
We are
is
going to
control
have
the money supply.
billions
I
spent
like to
on
explain this to
advertising.
people because I want
Not
everyone
because
to
it provides
understand
any
that when you
information
hear
that anybody
people
needs
say,
or wants,
gee, we want to get
not
the
because
government
it
out of the
clarifies
economy
anything.
Mostly
the
these
only
people
reason
are
we're
talking,
getting that money spent
the
on
top
all
of their
those
head,
people
they're
using
not
all of
this
their
far
brain power
from
and all of those
some
resources to give us yet another
Anyway,
reason to buy Pepsi.
they're not
And the reason we're
understanding
doing
is
that is
that
because they
all
have to,
modern
since Coca-Cola
societies
does it.
give
So we
to
have
their
to
governments
spend
the
billions on
control over the money
advertising.
supply,
Why?
over a
Because there
large
are
part of
already
the money
billions being
supply,
spent
if
on
not all of it.
advertising.
Because
This is
they're
not an
gonna
efficient use of
rely
resources.
on
This is
private
lunacy.
enterprises to control
This
the money
is
supply
craziness.
completely.
This is an economic
because
system
then
that is not
what we
only
have
not
is the way of
efficient,
money, which we all depend
but is
on
veering
in a
off the
modern
tracks
economy, would
into
be
the most
controlled by people
grotesque
whose motivations are
inefficiency
their private
and
profit,
waste
and
of
that's too
resources
dangerous.
one could imagine.
Let me say that again. Relying
Let me
on the
conclude
private profit
by
motive
giving you
is
what
too
is
dangerous for
arguably
something
the
that is
most
so important for
remarkable
us as a community,
craziness
as a collectivity,
about the
as a
economics of
society.
advertising.
So we give the government the job of
Ever ask
deciding how
yourself
much
the
money there
question,
is, how many
who
dollar bills
pays
and $10 bills
for the
and
advertising?
$20 bills and all
Who
the rest.
pays all the
And
money
the Federal Reserve
to have that billboard
creates
that
the
you
money.
pass
It
by in your
orders
automobile
the printed money to
advertise
be printed.
this or
It
that?
orders the
Who
coins to be
pays
made.
for the glitzy
It
ad
orders
at the
and
back of the
controls
magazine?
size
Who
of private
pays
banks' accounts
for the
at Federal
television
Reserve,
show that
accounts
you
they can
watch,
draw on, and that the
interrupted
Federal Reserve can simply
periodically
say
by
tomorrow
an
is larger by
advertisement
X
for
billion
who's ever
dollars than it was
funding the
last year.
television
Now
or
this
radio
bank has
show?
X billion more to
Who
draw
pays?
on.
Well, you
So
know
it
the answer on
creates
one level.
electronic money,
The
paper
company
money,
that makes the
and
product
coins. And it
pays
is
the
supposed
advertiser.
to do that in a
The company
way
that makes
that
the soda pop
maintains
pays
a
the
reasonable
advertiser
condition
who
for
puts
our
those
economies,
billboards everywhere.
that we don't have too much unemployment.
The company that
we don't have
makes
too
the
much
cigarette
inflation,
pays
and
the
so on.
advertiser.
It's a judgment
and
call,
so on.
and we give them
But
that
now let's
power.
review
But
the
that's where
economics here.
Quantity of money is
Where do you
most clearly
think the
controlled
company that
by
pays
that
the advertiser
governmental,
gets the
quasi-private,
money with which to
quasi-governmental,
pay the advertiser?
arrangement
The answer,
of an agency in
dear
which
fellow
banks and
citizen,
politicians
is you and
share
me.
a lot of authority.
We pay. We
And that
pay
do like
more
other
for the
societies.
products
But the
we
notion
buy
that we don't have the government
because
involved
the
in our
product
economy
we
is
buy
obviously rendered
requires
ridiculous once you
advertisement,
understand
or
the
at least they
role of the
think
Federal
they
Reserve.
do.
Something as fundamental.
Let me give you a couple of examples that, if you don't know about this, may shock you.
Our government. And if you
Many
literally-
over-the-counter
literally meant
medicines,
to get the government
you
out
know,
of the economy,
cough
and it wasn't gonna
syrups,
control the money supply,
aspirin
Lord
or
help us as to
aspirin-type
what would happen.
products,
Societies have a
anti-allergy
central bank
medicines, things like
precisely
that.
because they had the
Many of
experience
them
the
cost
economic and
pennies
political chaos
per pill,
produced if
per
you let
capsule.
the money supply
Pennies,
be
5
managed
cents,
by
and
private
to make.
profit-driven enterprise.
Oh, sure, you add a little bit
Okay.
because they had to
Another
have
question.
laboratories and
One of the
researchers to come up
reasons that
with these
an
compounds.
advanced industrial
And maybe that's
economy
another few
like
pennies.
those Japan, North America.
But then there's an
Western
enormous
Europe.
extra
What does it mean
expense
to say
that
and what
works
are the
out to
reasons
be
why they
20,
go to
30,
other
40,
countries?
50 cents,
The
much
reasons are
more
always
than it
multiple.
costs
One company goes
to
for
make
one
the
reason,
pill.
another
Much
for another.
more
But
than it
here's a
costs
list
to do the
keep in
research
mind
leading
when
to
you're
the pill.
thinking about this.
You know what that extra cost is?
Companies go
Advertising
abroad
it.
when they need
Making
to get
sure you see at
reliable
every
sources
turn
of
in your
raw
life,
material.
this is the
They buy
way
them there
to
and
cure
ship
your
them
headache.
home,
This is the
or
way
they establish enterprises
cure your
out there
allergies, to
in the
stop
other country
sneezing.
to be able to buy them.
So
to
guess what?
process them,
The
and to
reason you
ship them
have to
back.
pay
The
50
second
cents
reason
or a
corporations
dollar
go abroad
for a
is for
pill
food,
that costs 2
to
cents to
provide for
make
food,
is
either
because the
they
price
manufacture
of the
food, for
medicine
example, coffee
includes
companies go
the
to other
cost
countries
to the
for the
producer
simple
of
reason that
paying
in
for
most
the
of United States you can't
advertising.
grow coffee.
Now, let me
In
point
fact,
out
in
to you
very
what
few
that
parts of the United
means.
States, Louisiana,
You, when
Hawaii,
you
and so on,
buy
we can produce
over-the-counter
coffee, but
medicine,
nowhere near enough.
are
So if we're gonna be a
paying the
country that drinks
money
coffee, which we
required to
surely are,
convince
we're gonna
you
have to
to
have
buy
companies
that medicine.
either buy the coffee
You're
abroad
paying for
or
the
take
advertisement.
ownership of coffee producing
You are
farms
wasting
abroad and
your
so on.
money
So raw
to
materials,
produce
food,
what we have shown is
corporations need
bad
people
and
to buy what they
unreliable
produce.
advice.
Some of those buyers are abroad.
Wow.
They need to establish themselves in
Same
places
thing with
where
soda
they can
pop.
find and sustain
Soda pop,
buyers.
and I hate to break this
So
to you if
you
I'm
go
the first
abroad to
one.
find a market.
Soda pop
Finally,
is
you may also
water
go abroad
that
to get
contains
cheap
color
labor, because
and
it's cheaper than
sugar
hiring
and
workers
not much
in the United
else.
States. That's been particularly important in
Eh?
recent years, and still more.
wanna drink
people
that?
go
That's
abroad
your
because
business.
their taxes are lower, and you prefer to.
But
produce
when
there,
you
or they
go
don't have
and
environmental
produce
protection rules
water
the way we
with
do
some
here,
color and
all of
sugar
these
in it,
reasons
that doesn't
can
cost
motivate a company. Usually a
anything.
combination
That is
of these
unbelievably
reasons
cheap.
motivate a
Water is
company
cheap,
to act
sugar is
abroad,
cheap,
to buy and sell
and
abroad,
color
to
is
establish
cheap.
facilities abroad, to move production
And a few
abroad.
other
And here,
ingredients.
notice this:
They're cheap, too.
companies do that
What does it cost
because
to
it's
have a
privately
bottle of soda?
profitable for
5
them to do
cents.
that. And you know what often happens?
And
They get
tops.
into difficulty. They have
You know you
conflict
can't
abroad.
pay that.
And when they have conflict,
What are you
and
paying
they don't
for?
know how to
A
solve
lot of
them
laboratory
themselves,
work to
guess
invent
what?
a thing?
They call
No.
upon the
The
American
syrups
government
behind
to
these
help them,
pop top drinks
to protect
are
them, to
100 years
intervene,
old.
even with soldiers.
You know what you're
sometimes
paying
to
for?
make sure
the
they're
ads.
treated properly,
You're
that they can
paying
continue to earn
the
profit.
cost of all the
And who
billboards
pays
and all
for
the
the
TV
soldiers and the
spots and
cost
all the
of helping them?
advertising to get
You and
you to
I
drink
do.
soda
The
pop
government
A
uses tax
versus soda
money
pop
to
B.
get the military apparatus together.
That's the way
to
our
protect
system works.
What?
Is that
The
efficient?
private interests of private
Well, I hope you've
corporations
stopped laughing.
who made a private
It has nothing to
decision
do with
to maximize
efficiency.
their private
It has to do with the
profit by going abroad.
peculiarity of our
Colonialism,
economic system
imperialism, and
that
foreign
allows
adventures
private companies to
usually
quote
are
unquote
about
compete with
the
one
pressure
another,
exerted
tells us
by
all the
American
time how
businesses
wonderful that
dependent on
competition
profits
is,
abroad, who
without
want the
ever
government
admitting
at
in
the
an
cost
open
of
and
the
honest way
taxpayer
that one
to
of the
protect,
consequences of
to advance,
competition
and to secure
among private
their
enterprises is an
foreign-based
unspeakably
That's where the
wasteful
politics
loss
of a foreign
of
entanglement
people's
become
creativity
everybody's business.
and of countless
And one of the
resources
solutions
to do
to
something
conditions that end up
clogs
being
the
wars
airwaves
like in Vietnam,
with
South
information
Korea,
and
or
advice
Afghanistan,
that are
or Iraq,
fundamentally
is to
unbalanced
raise the
and
question,
unreliable.
rather than the government and the public being
That's a
brought in at the
cost
end to
of
save
competition.
what these
That's a
enterprises
cost
did. Why
of
aren't
capitalism.
we in there at the beginning, being part of
Imagine
a decision
if the
and
people,
making sure
those
we decide
creative
whether we want
artists
the gains of a foreign
and
entanglement
publicists
economically,
and people
if
who
it's
do
gonna
all the work
risk
of
causing
advertising.
us
Imagine
politically
if
and
we
militarily.
asked the American people,
Thank you
or the
so
British
much for
people, or the
being with me
European people, or the
today.
Asian
This
people, or
is
the African
Richard
people,
Wolff.
or
This is
anyone.
Economic Update,
Would you
and
rather
I hope
have
you will join me
endless
again
advertisements
next week.
that you mostly can't rely on and don't believe anyway? Or would you like to see all those resources used to beautify our cities and towns, to educate or better educate our children, to provide meaningful programs for the elderly in our community? You really think a system, a society, can't do better than the colossal waste of advertising? I think you could share with me the notion, yes, we can do better than advertising in an economic system, and we can do better with an economic system that doesn't cut back on the waste of advertising, but proliferates and enlarges it, finds ways to put advertising everywhere, even in places we had no idea could be polluted by yet more unbalanced and unreliable advice. Thank you very much for your attention. That's the end of our program for this week. This is Richard Wolff on Economic Update. Looking forward to connecting with you again next week.